Welcome back to the second episode of our Mughal Empire documentary series. In our first episode, we followed the dramatic rise of Babur, a young warrior from Central Asia who, through brilliant military tactics and unshakable determination, founded the Mughal Empire at the Battle of Panipat in 1526. We saw how he transformed himself from a dispossessed prince into an emperor, establishing a foothold in India that would grow into one of history's greatest empires. But as we learned, Babur's son Humayun struggled mightily to maintain his father's legacy. He faced continuous rebellions, lost his empire to rival Afghan forces, and spent years in exile in Persia before miraculously regaining his throne. Today, in the second part of our series, we'll explore how the Mughal Empire was not just restored, but was fundamentally transformed under the greatest ruler the Mughals would ever produce, the legendary Akbar the Great. We'll see how he took a fragile dynasty that had nearly collapsed into obscurity and transformed it into one of the most powerful and enlightened empires the world has ever witnessed, establishing the administrative and cultural foundations upon which the empire would flourish for another century and a half. When Babur died in 1530, after only 4 years of secure rule in India, his son Humayun inherited an empire that was constantly threatened from all sides. Humayun was, by all contemporary accounts, not naturally suited to the role of military conqueror and empire builder that fate had assigned to him. Unlike his father Babur, who had spent his entire life in military campaigns and had developed extraordinary military skills through decades of warfare, Humayun was more culturally inclined, more interested in art and poetry than in the rigorous demands of military command. This is not to say that Humayun was weak or incompetent. He was neither. Rather, he simply did not possess the exceptional military genius and iron determination that his father had possessed. In an era when an empire could only be held together through constant military vigilance and the willingness to use overwhelming force to crush rebellion, this was a significant disadvantage. Humayun's reign was marked by a series of military conflicts and political setbacks. He won some battles and lost others. He conquered territory and then lost it again. The empire expanded in some directions and contracted in others, as various regions rebelled or came under the control of rival powers. It was an exhausting period of constant warfare with no decisive resolution. By 1540, after a series of devastating defeats at the hands of the Suri dynasty under their leader Sher Shah Sur, Humayun found himself in an impossible situation. He had lost Delhi, he had lost Agra, he had lost the heartland of Mughal power. The Afghan Suri dynasty now controlled much of northern India, and Humayun's authority had been reduced to a few remaining strongholds. At this point, facing overwhelming military pressure and seeing no realistic prospect of victory, Humayun made the decision to abandon India entirely and seek refuge outside the subcontinent. The turning point came in the mid-1550s. The Suri dynasty, which had defeated Humayun and conquered much of India, was weakening from internal conflict and succession disputes. The moment seemed right for Humayun to attempt a comeback. With Persian military support, he gradually rebuilt his forces and began to move back toward India. In 1545, he captured Lahore and began to extend his control eastward. By 1555, after years of military campaigns, he had successfully recaptured Delhi and Agra, and much of northern India was acknowledging his authority once again. Humayun had accomplished the remarkable feat of returning from exile and reclaiming his empire. However, this triumph was to be tragically short-lived. In 1556, the very year that Humayun finally secured his complete authority over his empire, he died in a tragic accident, falling down the stairs of his palace in Delhi. Some sources suggest the accident was caused by intoxication or illness, but whatever the cause, Humayun died at the age of 47, having reclaimed his empire, but not having had the time to truly consolidate it and pass it on securely to his heir. This brought the Mughal dynasty to a critical crisis point that would determine whether the empire would survive and flourish or whether it would be destroyed and disappear into history. Humayun's eldest son, Jalal al-Din Muhammad Akbar, was only 13 years old when his father died. This was an extraordinarily dangerous situation. The empire was just barely consolidated, still surrounded by enemies and rivals who were waiting for any sign of weakness. A child emperor, without the military prestige and experience necessary to command authority, should, by all logic, have been a figurehead, easily manipulated by ambitious nobles and court officials, or worse, unable to prevent the complete disintegration of the empire. The empire should have fragmented into competing regional powers, each vying for control, with the Mughal dynasty reduced to irrelevance within a generation. This is what had happened to many other dynasties when they passed to incompetent or child heirs. Yet this is precisely what did not happen to the Mughal dynasty. Instead of collapsing, the empire not only survived, but entered its period of greatest expansion and greatest cultural achievement. The reason for this remarkable outcome was the exceptional intelligence, capability, and wisdom of the young Emperor Akbar, combined with his good fortune in having access to an exceptional regent. Akbar was fortunate to have as his regent and guardian Bayram Khan, one of the most capable military commanders in the entire empire. Bayram Khan was a man of proven military genius, unquestioned loyalty to the Mughal dynasty, and exceptional political wisdom. He had served Humayun faithfully and had been appointed by Humayun to serve as guardian and regent for his young son. Under Bayram Khan's leadership, the empire faced a significant military threat that could have destroyed it entirely. The Hindu general Hemu, who had been advancing toward Delhi with the intention of reconquering the city and destroying Mughal power, represented perhaps the greatest threat the young empire had faced since Babur's time. The critical moment in the fate of the Mughal Empire came at the Second Battle of Panipat in 1556, the very place where Babur had founded the empire just 30 years earlier. In this battle, Bayram Khan's forces, commanding young Akbar's armies, defeated Hemu decisively, preventing what would have been the collapse of the Mughal state and the end of the dynasty. This victory secured the young Akbar's throne and gave him and the Mughal Empire the breathing room and the stability necessary to develop as a ruling power rather than being destroyed in infancy. Without this victory, the entire history of India and of the world would have been different. By the early 1560s, when Akbar was in his late teens and early 20s, he was coming of age and beginning to govern in his own right. He dismissed Bayram Khan, which was a risky move, but which demonstrated his emerging political confidence and his desire to establish his own authority rather than remaining dependent on a regent. What followed over the next 4 decades of Akbar's reign, from the early 1560s until his death in 1605, was one of the most remarkable periods of imperial development and achievement that the world has ever witnessed. Akbar, unlike many rulers of his time who were content to simply rule without deeply understanding the mechanisms of power, was intensely interested in how empires actually functioned at the most fundamental level. He wanted to understand not just how to win battles, though he was certainly capable of that, but how to govern vast populations effectively, how to collect revenue efficiently, how to administer justice fairly and impartially, and how to create a sense of unified imperial identity that could transcend religious, ethnic, and regional boundaries. These were the questions that occupied his mind and that drove his policies. Militarily, Akbar proved to be every bit the equal of his great-grandfather Babur. During his reign from 1556 to 1605, he undertook a series of military campaigns that vastly expanded Mughal territory in virtually every direction. He conquered Gujarat in 1572, bringing under Mughal control that region's wealthy ports and important commercial centers. He subdued the Rajputs, that proud warrior class with their own ancient codes of honor and their own traditions of military strength, who had long resisted Mughal authority. However, rather than simply crushing them through military force, as previous conquerors might have done, Akbar employed a brilliant political strategy of co-optation and integration. He married into Rajput families, making them part of his extended imperial family and binding them to the Mughal dynasty through bonds of kinship and mutual interest. He made Rajput nobles part of his imperial administration, giving them positions of honor and responsibility. He incorporated them into the imperial military hierarchy, making them generals and commanders in the Mughal army. This approach, which might have seemed strange to contemporary observers accustomed to conquered peoples being simply suppressed or exploited, was actually a stroke of political genius. It transformed potential enemies into loyal supporters, bound to the Mughal cause not through force, but through shared interest and family ties. The most famous example of this strategy was his marriage to Jodha-bai, the daughter of the Rajput king of Amber, which created a dynastic alliance that helped stabilize Mughal rule in northern India and brought the Rajputs more fully into the Mughal power structure. By the time Akbar had finished his military campaigns, he had brought under Mughal control virtually all of the Indian subcontinent, except for the far south and some isolated regions that remained outside Mughal authority. The empire had expanded from the relatively modest territory that Babur had conquered to encompass an area of breathtaking size. But perhaps most importantly, Akbar championed a policy of religious tolerance and pluralism that was extraordinary and remarkable for its time. This was an era when religious intolerance was the norm across much of the world, when rulers typically favored their own religious communities over others, when conversion or suppression of minority religions was considered a sign of devotion and orthodoxy. This religious tolerance and pluralism was not merely idealistic philosophy, it was strategically brilliant statesmanship. The majority of Akbar's subjects were Hindu, and by treating them as equal participants in the empire rather than as subjects of a foreign conqueror, he created a profound sense of shared investment in the empire's success. Hindu soldiers fought with the same loyalty as Muslim soldiers. Hindu administrators served with the same dedication as Muslim counterparts. Hindu merchants and traders prospered. This unity across religious lines gave the Mughal Empire under Akbar a stability and legitimacy that purely military rule could never have provided. It transformed the empire from a state of military occupation into a genuine civilizational empire, in which people of diverse backgrounds saw themselves as participants rather than as subjects. By the time Akbar died in 1605, he had fundamentally transformed the nature and character of the Mughal Empire. He had taken what his father Humayun and his great-grandfather Babur had established, a military conquest, a state held together primarily by force, and transformed it into a genuine civilizational empire, united by shared administrative systems, cultural practices, and a genuine sense of common imperial identity that transcended religious and ethnic boundaries. The empire he left behind extended across most of the Indian subcontinent and encompassed hundreds of millions of people of diverse religions, languages, and cultures, all united under one imperial rule. In our third episode, we'll see how Akbar's successors, particularly his great-grandson Shah Jahan, would take the magnificent foundation that Akbar created and build upon it, creating some of the most beautiful and magnificent monuments the world has ever seen. The eternal symbol of Mughal achievement, the Taj Mahal, that incomparable monument to love, was still nearly a century in the future, but it would be built by an emperor who was operating within the very administrative, cultural, and political system that Akbar had established. Join us in our next episode as we explore the absolute zenith of Mughal architectural and cultural achievement.